To prepare our minds and our hearts to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, I'd like us all turn to Hebrews chapter 10, please. Hebrews, the 10th chapter. This morning I want us to think together about what made Jesus' sacrifice so special. And of course, there are so many things that could be said about that. But specifically, I want to talk about what made it so much better than animal sacrifices under the law of Moses system. Leading up to this chapter, the Hebrew writer has been explaining why the ministry of Jesus is a superior ministry to the ministry of the Levitical priests under that Old Covenant system. He gives several reasons for it. But when he gets to chapter 10, he argues that Jesus offers a better sacrifice than the animals that the Levitical priest sacrificed. Let's explore why. First of all, let's set animal sacrifices in its proper context. We learn way back in the beginning, in Genesis chapter 2, when God gives His command to Adam and Eve not to eat from that one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He says, "In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." Well, that not only meant that they would die physically, they would not live eternally anymore, but they would also die spiritually. They would experience the spiritual death that comes from being separated from their Creator because of their sin. Well, because of God's mercy and His love and kindness, He allowed people to offer animals in their place. Instead of their own death, they could put an animal to death, and that animal's death would cover them or atone for them. In Hebrews 10, verses 1 through 4, he gives us three reasons why animal sacrifices were insufficient. Let's read these verses 1 through 4. It says, "For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of things, can never, by the same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, will they not have ceased to be offered? Because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have had consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins year by year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." The first reason he says animal sacrifices were insufficient is because if they were actually sufficient, if they were actually effective, they would not have needed to be offered over and over again. Hopefully, none of you have been in this situation, but maybe some of you have, where you have to go back to a mechanic over and over and over again to fix your vehicle. It seems like every time you go to get it fixed, something else breaks and you have to take it back again. Well, that's a good sign that you probably just need to get a different vehicle because your vehicle is no longer effective. If it was a good, effective car, it would not need to be constantly fixed. And truth be told, even the mechanic's best efforts are ineffective as well because of what he's working with. There's nothing that mechanic can do to really solve the problem. Likewise, people would come to offer animal sacrifices to repair their souls. Their souls had become defective because of sin, but those sacrifices ultimately could not solve the problem. If offering animal sacrifices really fixed things and took care of that sin problem, they would not have to keep going back to the priests over and over again, year by year, all the time. Something was insufficient about those animal sacrifices. Something was even insufficient about the best efforts of the priests to take care of that problem because of what they were working with, sinful souls. Secondly, those animal sacrifices were not really removing their sins, they were reminding them of their sins. And what a vivid reminder that would be. When you go back and read the law, particularly Leviticus 4 and verse 4, talking about the sin offering, it says, "He shall bring the bull to the doorway of the tent of meeting before the Lord, and he shall lay his hand on the head of the bull and slay the bull before the Lord." Well, let's try, if we can, to put ourselves in the shoes of the Israelites under that Old Covenant system. You know that you are a sinner who deserves death in God's eyes. Yet because of God's mercy and grace, you can go and offer an animal up in your place. So you take a calf and you bring him to the priest, and the priest examines the sacrifice and makes sure it's an acceptable sacrifice to the Lord. And once he gives you permission, you then have to take your hand, put your hand on the head of this animal, probably to signify you are directly connected to this animal. This animal is symbolically taking your sins upon itself and dying because of you, because of your sin, and then you have to be the one to kill, to cut the throat of that animal and watch that blood drain out. And then you have to watch the priest take that blood and sprinkle it on the tent of meeting. Could there be any more vivid reminder of sin, of your own sin, than to have to watch innocent animals die on a regular basis in a very graphic way in your place? Every time they offered an animal, and every time the priests offered animals on behalf of the entire congregation, remember once a year on the Day of Atonement, it would remind the people how sinful they were and how much in need of God's grace they were. It's why the Day of Atonement wasn't really a happy, joyful time. It was described as a time of humility and fasting. The Hebrew writer says it gave them a conscious awareness, a consciousness of how sinful they really were. Going back to the illustration, if your car needs repairs all the time, when you bring your car to the mechanic, it's not really a hopeful situation. There's a point at which you brought this car in so many times, you know, even if this mechanic fixes something, it might feel good temporarily to have the immediate problem solved, but you know in your heart and in your mind, it's only a matter of time before you're bringing that car back in, because the problem really hasn't been solved. And thirdly, he says it's impossible for the blood of animals to take away sins. Now, it's certainly true that God accepted animal blood as payment for their sins by grace, but if you think about it, how does the death of an animal really serve as an adequate substitute for the death of a human being? As humans, we're rational beings, made in the image of God, who chose to sin against God, yet in their place they're offering innocent animals who have no idea what's going on. Those animals did not do anything wrong. They didn't commit any sin. They just live by instinct. An animal life for a human life, that's not a fair trade at all. And I believe the Jews understood that deep down, which is why even though God said they could be forgiven by offering those sacrifices, they still had a conscious awareness. They still had a consciousness of sins, that things weren't quite right still. Let's say your mechanic has been fixing your car for you, and you've gone to him so many times, it has just drained your bank account. You have no money to pay for any more repairs. You have no money to buy a new car. And when I say new, I'm not even talking about brand new. I just mean new to you, even to go buy a used car. You don't have any money left because of all these repairs. Now imagine your mechanic. He knows your situation. And out of the kindness of his heart, he says, look, I'll make you a deal. I know you don't have any money, but I'm going to let you pay me. He says, I know this sounds weird. I'm going to let you pay me in monopoly money. Every time you bring your car in, whatever the total is, you just bring in monopoly money, and I'll take that as payment. Well, you're going to be really confused, right? But you're going to be amazed by his generosity as well, and so grateful he's willing to do that for you. But you know in your heart, that's not a fair deal. You know it costs him to fix your vehicle, and you know that you're not paying him what you really owe, because monopoly money is not real money. Likewise, God accepted those animal sacrifices by his grace and mercy, but an animal sacrifice is like monopoly money. It is not the real payment we owe God for our sins, which is our own death. Those sacrifices didn't really pay the price for sin. They were woefully inadequate. As we continue in the text in Hebrews 10, The Hebrew writer contrasts those animal sacrifices with the sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf. And he quotes from the Old Testament, from Psalm chapter 40. And the way he does it is he uses it and quotes it as if Jesus were the one saying it. So beginning in verse 5 down through verse 7, therefore, when he, Jesus, comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, to do your will, O God. These verses show that God has never really wanted animals from His people. Oh yeah, He commanded that they offer these sacrifices, again as a means of grace to make payment for their sin, but God never really wanted or needed those animals. All the animals belong to God already. What He has always wanted was the devotion and love of the person offering those sacrifices. What God has always wanted was for us to use our bodies to live in complete obedience to Him because we love Him. A body you have prepared for me. This is consistent with other passages in the Old Testament about animal sacrifices. We've been studying about Saul not too long ago, and remember when Samuel rebukes him in 1 Samuel 15, verse 22, he asked this question, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. Hosea says in chapter 6 and verse 6, I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice. Micah 6 through 8, with what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to Him with burnt offerings, with yearly calves? Does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams, in 10,000 rivers of oil? He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Think now about Jesus. Jesus is the only one who ever gave God what He really wanted. He gave God His body in total devotion and obedience from the heart. Verse 7, I said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God. He says in the scroll of the book, it is written of me. Could be the scroll of the book probably is the law of Moses, which not only prophesied about Jesus, but describes the kind of person that God is looking for, the kind of person who actually does the will of God and obeys Him. And Jesus is saying through this psalm, I didn't come just to give you animal sacrifices, God. I came to be the person who actually does your will and who obeys you even to the point of giving you my entire life and body. And when He did that, He accomplished two things. One, He took care of the sin problem. When He died, the real substitute, human blood for human blood, was made. The real price for sin, which is human life, was paid. Now, of course, we recognize Jesus was also divine. So it wasn't like His one human life was a sacrifice for just one other human life. Maybe if He was only human, that would have been the case. But because He's divine, His sacrifice actually covered the lives of all humanity. Back to our mechanic example, if we've been paying in Monopoly money for a while, we'd probably be feeling guilty and self-conscious about that because we know how much we really owe. Even though the mechanic says we're square, he says things are fine, we know things aren't really quite right yet. Now imagine someone comes up to the mechanic and says, listen, I want to pay this person's debt. They won't have to pay you in Monopoly money anymore. And in fact, I'm going to buy this person a brand new car and I'm going to pay for any future maintenance they'll ever need on that car. That's what Jesus did for us. He used real money to pay the debt we owed, so we don't have to try to pay God in monopoly money, in animal sacrifices anymore that didn't really solve the problem. Verse 10 says, "By this will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all." The problem with our souls, which had become defective with sin, has been fixed once and for all. And secondly, when He did that, He showed us the kind of person God is looking for. Verse 9, the end of that, says, He takes away the first in order to establish the second. That not only means that we don't have to offer animal sacrifices anymore under that first covenant. He brings in a second, a better covenant. It also means He established a superior system by which our hearts are actually forgiven and transformed, and now in gratitude for His sacrifice, we can give God what He's always been wanting. We can give Him our bodies in total devotion from the heart. We can strive to live like the person in Psalm 40. In fact, remember what Paul said in Romans 12:1? He says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." While it is a wonderful thing to gather around this table and partake of the Lord's Supper in memory of the body Jesus gave for us, the greatest way to honor His memory is to strive daily for the kind of devotion Jesus had. To say with the psalmist, "Behold, I have come to do your will, O God."